Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating text that offers up a completely different story of Jesus, specifically focusing on those so-called missing years. And trust me, the way this information was gathered is, well, it's pretty unconventional.
So the source material we're looking at, Dolores Cannon's work, kicks off with this very question. See, the idea isn't to say the traditional story is wrong, but to ask, what if it's just incomplete? What if we're missing a huge chunk of the story, specifically that time between his childhood and when he suddenly appears as a public teacher?
All right, so let's get right into it. The whole foundation of this book isn't to argue that the Bible is wrong. Not at all. The argument is that it's simply incomplete. Like someone took out some of the most important chapters, and they've been lost, or maybe even intentionally hidden. And this is a really important point for the author, Dolores Cannon. She saw herself as recovering lost information. She was always super clear about this. She didn't see herself as a channeler or some kind of mystic. She insisted she was more like a reporter, just piecing together a story that she believed wanted to be told. Okay, so you're probably asking, where on earth is this new information coming from? Well, the text points to let's just say, a very unconventional method for digging up these lost memories. And this method is really the foundation for this entire alternative story. So how exactly was this lost history brought back to light? This next part gets into the very unique and, for a lot of people, pretty controversial method that's at the heart of this whole thing. The entire story is built on this technique called deep remembrance. Now, what is that? The source describes it as a kind of deep hypnosis where people can supposedly access memories stored way down in their subconscious. The idea is they can get to a state where they are recalling historical events as if they were right there, seeing it with their own eyes.
And again, Cannon really frames her role here not as some guru, but as an investigative reporter of the subconscious. She'd say, I ask questions, I follow leads. And this wasn't just based on one person's account. She explains that she cross-referenced details from thousands of sessions, and she really paid attention when the exact same historical details started popping up from totally different people. Okay, so now for the really interesting part. What's the story that this method supposedly uncovered about Jesus' youth and training? Well, it paints a picture of a much, much more extensive and, you could say, global education than the one we're typically told.
So according to the source, his formal education kicked off with a group called the Essenes, a pretty disciplined and secretive community out by the Dead Sea. The text describes them as these guardians of ancient hidden wisdom. And get this, they supposedly instructed both him and John the Baptist in all sorts of subjects, everything from the law to astronomy and healing. But wait, it didn't stop there. Not even close. The source talks about these extensive world travels, apparently paid for by his super wealthy and influential uncle, Joseph of Arimathea. These journeys supposedly took him all over, west to learn from Druids in Britain, and then all the way east to study with masters in India and Tibet. And here's the crucial point. This global education was supposedly the key to forming his core message. The idea here is that he wasn't just born with all this knowledge fully formed. Instead, he actively gathered and put together wisdom from all these different cultures and spiritual traditions around the world. So after all that learning and travel, what was the central message? Well, the text presents it as something truly radical for its time, a complete departure from the religious norms, and really a fundamental shift in how people should think about God and each other. And this slide just lays it out so clearly. It was this massive philosophical shift, right? Moving away from a system based on fear, on punishment, on all these complex laws, and moving toward one based on love and inner truth. The source argues that his whole goal was to replace this idea of a condemning, angry God with a philosophy built entirely on compassion. And how did he get this message across? He apparently chose to teach through simple stories, parables. Using images that everyone could get. Seeds, soil, birds, water. The source claims this was a very deliberate choice to make sure his message could be understood by everyone, the poor, the uneducated, not just the highly trained religious scholars. All right, so finally, the source gets into what happened to this teaching after the crucifixion, and it describes this real conflict between the original, simple movement and the massive, structured institution that it eventually became. See, in the very beginning, his followers didn't really form a religion in the way we think of it now. It was called the Way, just a simple path for living. It was decentralized, no big hierarchy, no supreme leader. People just met in their homes, shared what they understood openly. And women, like Mary Magdalene, were actually respected as teachers. But the text claims that over the generations, that all changed. Councils of men gathered to create a formal structure. They're the ones who chose which writings to keep and which to toss out. They apparently removed teachings that they found too difficult, like reincarnation, and they started building these walls of doctrine and hierarchy around what was once a very simple open message. So the big takeaway here, according to the source, is that the story was essentially reshaped to fit the needs of a growing institution. What started as this very personal, decentralized path of understanding was transformed into a centralized system of authority, often using the very same fear that the original message was designed to replace. And that leaves us with a final and pretty provocative question to think about. This alternative account really shines a light on that powerful tension between an original, personal message and the institution that carries it forward. It kind of forces you to ask, what happens to any story when it's retold generation after generation by those in power?